Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Black Hat 2019. As you go on and make your way on inside, go ahead and scoot toward the middle of the rows to make room for those that are filing in. Welcome to a decade after Bleichenbacher 06, RSA signature forgery still works in the room Jasmine with Sze Yiu. So this morning, I've just got a few brief notes before we begin. Make sure to stop by the business hall located in Mandalay Bay, Oceanside, and Shoreline ballrooms on level 2 during the day and for welcome reception at 5:30 tonight. The Black Hat Arsenal is located in the business hall on level 2. And then join us for the Pony Awards in Lagoon GHI at 18:30. And then also lunch will be served in Bayside AB from 12:05 to 1:30. And then thank you for putting your phone on vibrate. It makes it easier for the rest of us to ignore the ringing while you wait for your voicemail to pick it up. Without any further ado, I present Sze Yiu.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, and thank you for coming to this session. In this talk, we'll look at the problem of Bleichenbacher 06 RSA signature forgery attack, and we'll go through how it still works after more than a decade. So first, a little bit about myself. My name is Sze Yiu, and I was born and raised in Hong Kong. I just got my PhD in computer science from Purdue University last week. And thank you. And I'll be joining the Department of Information Engineering at CUHK in Hong Kong next year. CUHK is one of the top public research universities in Hong Kong. And my research interest is mainly on the insecure design and implementations of different protocols. Okay. So before we get into the technical details, right, let's start with a little brain teaser. So if I give you X509 certificates, SSH, IPsec, and DNSSEC, what is common among these protocols? Okay. So you might be thinking that they all have RFCs, of course, right? You might be thinking that they're all security critical, sure, but that's not the point. So it might not be obvious at first, but turns out that they can all benefit from the PKCS 1 version 1.5 RSA signatures, right? So I guess now would be a good time to review the textbook RSA signature. So for the signer to sign for message M, what the signer would do is to compute hash of M, and then raise hash of M to D mod N. D is obviously the private exponent, N being the modulus. And then you get S at the signature. So now to verify that S is indeed a valid signature of message M, what the verifier would do is to take S and raise it to E mod N, where E is obviously the public exponent, and then compare and see whether it's equal to hash of M. Right? Very simple. Unfortunately, reality is usually much more complex than what you would expect. The first problem here is that the verifier has to know what hash algorithm to use, right? So there are so many different choices. And the second problem here is that the modulus N is usually much longer than the output of hash algorithms. So for example, nowadays, I think it is fairly common to see a modulus of at least 2048-bit, but the SHA outputs are fairly small. So because of that, what you need is some metadata and some padding, which is exactly why we have this PKCS1 family of standards. So PKCS1 defines both encryption and signature schemes. Even though there are newer versions of the standard, as of today, I think for RSA signatures, the version 1.5 standard is still the most widely used one. For example, certificates of Google and Wikipedia, they are all signed using this version 1.5 scheme. So in this scheme, to sign for message M, instead of computing hash of M raised to D mod N, the signer would instead do K raised to D mod N. And K looks like this, right? So K starts with an initial byte of 0, followed by a byte of block type, which for a signature has to be 01. And then you have a bunch of padding bytes. For a signature, it has to be hexadecimal FF all the way. It has to be at least 8 bytes long. And the point of having padding is, of course, to make K as long as the modulus N. And then you have an N of padding 0. And then you have AS structure, which is a DER encoded ASN1 structure. containing the metadata describing the hash algorithm, as well as the actual hash of M. And the encoded AS looks like this. It's a chunk of bytes. So the example I'm using here assumes that the hash algorithm is SHA-1, and the message M is hello world. So notice that this is a DER encoded object. So it is basically a tree of tag length value triplets. So the first value bytes can be separated into two subtrees. The first one is made of two child nodes. The first leaf node would actually give you the OID, the object identifier of the hash algorithm. The second leaf node would give you the algorithm parameters, which for most of the hash algorithm that we use today, we don't really use a parameter, so we just put a null parameter there. And then finally, the second subtree, the last leaf node of the length values in this tree. So the length values actually add up from the leaf node all the way back to the root in the benign cases. So now given a signature S in this version 1.5 scheme, what the verifier would do is to take signature S and raise it to E mod N, let's call it R. And R should look exactly like K from before. So now what the verifier has to do is to first check whether R is well formed. And then the verifier would compute hash of M and see whether it matches with the hash inside R. And turns out this is problematic. There are all kinds of leniencies in the well-formedness check. Which brings us to Bleichenbacher's low exponent attack. So this is yet another crypto attack attributed to Daniel Bleichenbacher. So I think the first documented report came in Crypto 6 ROM session. So basically he figured out that some implementations of the signature verification would accept a R prime that looks a lot like R, but with extra garbage bytes trailing after AS. And because of that, existential forgery is possible when the public exponent is small, meaning that an attacker can generate signatures for some message M without possessing the private exponent D. And this is one of the major contributing factors to the push for using a bigger E. But because smaller E is more efficient for the signature verifier, historically many protocols actually prescribe the use of E equals to 3. For example, the RFCs for DNSSEC, I think they recommend E equals to 3 under certain circumstances. Okay. And speaking of Bleichenbacher, there are at least 2 lines of attacks on PKCS 1 version 1.5 attributed to him. One is the padding oracle attack, which of course inspired a lot of follow-up research. And for signature verification, which is the focus of this talk, the first report came from, I think came in 2006. And then in 2008, there are some follow-up research on the attack algorithm as well as the analysis. And then in 2014, I believe Intel Security wrote a report saying that certain versions of Mozilla NSS is susceptible to variants of the original Bleichenbacher attack. And then in 2016, there's another report claiming that the Python RSA module is also problematic. And the legacy of Bleichenbacher 06 is, of course, did not end there, because this year at NDSS 2019, we published a new paper finding more variants of the Bleichenbacher 06 attack in different implementations. So since both of these are on PKCS 1 version 1.5, and both of them are attributed to Daniel Bleichenbacher, I think it would be useful to give you a high overview of what are the differences. So the padding oracle attack, it is exploiting some side-channel leakages. The goal of that is to kind of get a decryption oracle out of it. And the victim there would be typically having the private key, the private exponent for decryption to happen. But for signature verification, the victim is actually a signature verifier without holding the private exponent. What the signature verifier has is the public key. And due to some logical flaws inside the signature verification code, in some cases it is possible to generate fixed signatures for signature forgery to happen. Okay. Now, one thing I learned as a PhD student and as well as a teaching assistant is that if somewhere someone slipped on a banana peel, chances are, somewhere else someone would also slip on a different but similar looking banana peel. So going back to the original brain teaser, turns out the implementations of all these different protocols, they can all suffer from these PKCS 1 version 1.5 RSA signatures. So why was the attack possible? Right, so the root cause of the problem is that the signature verifier would accept certain malformed input with some garbage bytes left unchecked. And as I'll explain later, this can happen in many different locations, not only at the end of R. And even though a longer modulus would make factorization supposedly harder, in this case, if you're using this flaw to do signature forgery, a longer modulus will actually make it easier because the attacker will have more garbage bits to play with. And this can be used to handle a slightly longer hash or a slightly larger E. So to find these kind of potential Bleichenbacher 06 attacks, we would like to see how the input bytes are being validated by the signature verifier. And if there are enough unchecked garbage bytes, then signature forgery might be possible. And our position is that this is a problem well suited for symbolic execution. So to use symbolic execution to kind of find these potential Bleichenbacher 06 attacks, so we try to automatically generate concolic test cases for this particular problem. The key observation there is that the size of components used by PKCS 1 version 1.5, they exhibit very nice linear relations, right? For example, the summation of the length of all the components, they have to be exactly as long as the size of the modulus. And also, if you think about the DER encoded structure, the length also add up from the leaf back to the root. So what we can do is programmatically capture these linear constraints. And then we ask symbolic execution to kind of find satisfiable solutions on the fly. And based on that, we can automatically pack mixture of symbolic and concrete components into the test buffers. And once we have these concolic test cases generated, we can use symbolic execution to extract the signature verification logic and abstract them in terms of logical formulas. So this is a very useful abstraction because it helps us understand what and how things are being checked inside the signature verification code. And with the formula abstraction, we can also automatically cross-validate different implementations to see whether they agree with each other. So we applied our technique into analyzing 15 recent implementations of PKCS 1 version 1.5 RSA signature verification, including some SSL libraries, crypto libraries, SSH and IPsec implementations. So it turns out 6 of them are overly lenient, and 4 of them are susceptible to a practical signature forgery under a small public exponent, confirming my theory on people slipping on banana peels. So the first problem we found was in Openswan. We found that Openswan was ignoring padding bytes. It's a simple oversight, but with severe implications because attackers can exploit this for signature forgery. So what the attacker can do is to use this malformed out prime and hide garbage bytes in the unchecked padding bytes. So what the attacker wants is to find A and B such that A cube would give you what is needed to match before the garbage. The least significant bits of B cube would give you what is needed after garbage, and the rest would stay inside the unchecked garbage bytes. And once you found it, then the fixed signature is simply A plus B. So if you're interested in the exact algorithm, I'll refer you to our NDSS paper. So to convince the developers of Openswan, we send them a bunch of generated fixed signatures that would work against any modulus of a chosen size. I think they liked our fixed signatures, and in fact, they took one of our fixed signatures and turned it into a new unit test in their source tree. And of course, they also fixed the problems. Okay, so let's move on to strongSwan. The first problem we found in strongSwan is that they're not checking the algorithm parameters. This is a classical flaw found in GNU TLS and Firefox many, many years ago. And of course, this is exploitable for signature forgery. Basically, the attacker can hide garbage bytes in the unchecked algorithm parameter and then adopt the Openswan attack algorithm to generate fixed signatures. Okay. The second problem in strongSwan was that they are accepting trailing bytes after the algorithm object identifier. So interestingly, in strongSwan's implementation, the OID is not matched exactly. So what they're doing is a variant of a longest prefix match, which means on the left-hand side, you have the correctly encoded OID for SHA-1, and on the right-hand side, you have the correct OID added with some extra trailing garbage bytes after the OID. And because of the longest prefix match, both would be recognized as correct OIDs for SHA-1. And knowing that, an attacker can hide garbage after the correct OID. And again, using the Openswan attack algorithm, you can generate fixed signatures. Fortunately, strongSwan quickly fixed the problems after we send them a report. You might be thinking that in the X509 ecosystem, for example, there are not too many E equals to 3 being used. But we noticed that in the IPsec ecosystem, there are still key generation programs that forces E equals to 3. So depending on the deployment scenario, the flaws in Openswan and strongSwan can potentially be used to break authentication in IPsec-based VPN deployments. Okay. So then we also found a couple of problems in AXTRS. So the first issue is that they were accepting trailing garbage bytes. So that means the original Bleichenbacher 06 attack would simply work. And then on top of that, they are also ignoring some prefix bytes of the PKCS 1 version 1.5 scheme. So the first 10 bytes are not being checked at all, which means you can actually make it easier to win the signature forgery game. So by making the first 90 bits all 0, you can reduce the distance between two consecutive cubes. So it would be much easier to find a fixed signature, meaning that the attacker doesn't even need to do a lot of brute force trials. So the third issue in AXTRS was that they were ignoring the algorithm identifier. So given this encoded AS and the parsing code, so this complete chunk would be skipped by the parser. This is probably because certificates already have an explicit field telling the signature verifier which hash algorithm to use. But just because you know the hash algorithm from outside doesn't mean that this can be skipped, because the attacker can then use this malformed out prime to hide garbage values inside the unchecked algorithm identifier. And then again, you use the Openswan attack algorithm, you can generate fixed signatures. Finally, one more issue in AXTRS. We found that AXTRS was trusting the declared length without any sanity checks. So what that means is that if you take the encoded AS, and an attacker can put absurdly large values in the length, in the declared length, to trick the signature verifier into performing some illegal memory access. So as a proof of concept, we declared a really large, really long hash output, and we managed to crash the signature verifier. And this is particularly problematic because the way that AXTRS does certificate validation is in a bottom-up manner. So what that means is that even if in the wild nobody is using small public exponent, any man in the middle can just inject a fixed certificate with E equals to 3 and crash the verifier before the verifier has a chance to traverse a chain all the way up to some trusted root anchor. We helped them develop the fix originally for the ESP8266 port, and later our patch has been accepted by the upstream AXTRS maintainer, which is good because AXTRS seems to be somewhat popular. I think according to SourceForge, every week there are 20 to 30 downloads. Finally, there are some other leniencies. For example, in matrix SSL, we found that for the length values, it would accept, the signature verifier would accept many possible values. That means some bits in the middle of AS can take arbitrary any values, but that doesn't seem to be long enough to mount an immediate practical attack. And there are other variants of these leniencies also in Embed TLS and libtomcrypt. Fortunately, even though we don't have an immediate attack, the matrix SSL developers quickly fixed this problem. Okay, so here are the lessons learned. So the first lesson learned is that cutting corner is not cool, right? So given a specification, there are some mandated checks. If you do not follow the requirements faithfully, right? It's tantamount to planting a ticking time bomb. And I promise that it would come back and haunt you, right? So I mentioned earlier that after more than a decade, this attack still works, which is kind of cool. The second thing is, I think developers should learn from each other's mistakes, especially when they are implementing the same standard, right? So if you slipped on a banana peel, you better warn the whole world that bananas can be really evil, right? So for communicating common vulnerabilities, we do have CVEs, but apparently that's not good enough. I think it would be interesting to see how we can, I guess, disseminate these informations to different developers so that we can kind of enforce community learning, right? Like I said, there are so many open standards and there are many competing implementations basically doing the same thing. So they should be able to learn, from each other's mistakes. And finally, parsing is hard, right? So particularly when you are given a complex structure with many optional features, right? So if you're trying to handle all these different cases, it's kind of like walking through a maze, right? And another important observation here is that robustness, what robustness means really depends on the context. So if you're thinking about a generic parser, it is perfectly fine to assume that the parser would be still able to salvage some useful information out of a malformed input and let the computation proceed. But that is probably not what you want for a security critical task like signature verification, for example. And I guess in the long run, it would be good to think about the trade-offs between flexibility and complexity, right? So in many cases, being flexible, being future-proof is really good, but you have to also think about at what cost, right? So in some cases, making it really complex, so complex that in fact people are messing up their implementation, then you don't actually gain security. Okay. So with that, I would also like to take this opportunity to thank my collaborators from the U of Iowa, as well as my 2 advisors from Purdue University. And with that, I think we have roughly 4 minutes for questions. Thank you so much. Any questions?
Hi. How long does it take for forging a signature for a certificate with this technique?
Would you mind speaking up a little bit? I couldn't hear.
How long was it taking to produce the forged signatures with your method?
I think the time required really depends on the different parameters. For example, the size of the modulus and which hash algorithm you are choosing. In many cases, it's almost 01, I think. So like I said, if you have a longer modulus, then it tends to be easier to forge. But then if you have a longer hash output, then you lose garbage bytes. So you want more of them. But I think in most of the cases, it's almost 01. Because so the flaws that I presented, you can use them in tandem to maximize the playroom that you have as an attacker. So then I think most of them are 01. The original analysis, I think if you're assuming a 1024-bit modulus, then it's about 2 to 19 brute force trials.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yep. So any other questions? If you are too shy to ask, you can meet me in the wrap-up room if you want, and we can talk more. Yep. Okay, so thank you.